When you think of the name Hudson Soft, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Bonk? Adventure Island? Super Adventure Island? The fact that the company was bought out and then dismantled by Konami? For a lot of you, the first thing that came to mind was probably Bomberman. And I don't blame you, it is one of their biggest, if not their absolute biggest franchise. Admittedly, I haven't played too many Bomberman games myself. In fact, I can count the number of ones I've played on one hand. Bomberman Tournament was one of the first GBA games I played, and I played a pretty sizable bit of Bomberman Generation for the GameCube. And while I never got a chance to check out any of the Bomberman 64 games, they looked pretty interesting, and apparently they've ended up gaining a dedicated following. Though there was one Bomberman game for the Nintendo 64 that I did get a chance to play, and that was the 1998 platformer Bomberman Hero. Come to think of it, for a series heavily loved for its multiplayer, the only ones that I've played are primarily single player. And the one that I have the most memories of was the only 3D platformer they ever made. It's the one that had the biggest impact on my childhood. For the sake of transparency, I will state now that yes, I am going to be playing this game off of an emulator. I unfortunately lost my original copy of it some time ago, and while the game was re-released on the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console back in 2011, the service has since been discontinued, and I unfortunately wasn't able to snag it in time. The only Nintendo 64 that I own is dead anyway, and I don't have proper cables to capture N64 footage with, so this was really my only option. And with that, welcome back to Right in the Childhood, a look at my personal favorite games from my childhood seen through a more matured lens. I'm still working on a tagline. Before we begin dissecting the game, let me give you a little bit of my own personal history with it. I rented it from my local Blockbuster Video on a hot spring... What the fuck? My fan turned itself back on. What the shit? I rented it from my local Blockbuster Video on a hot spring day in the year 2000. Just a couple of months after getting my first N64. And as soon as that intro cutscene started, I knew this game was going to stick with me. I eventually ended up buying it not too long after. The summer of 2000 saw me playing a lot of Nintendo 64 games. Pokemon Stadium, Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, Tonic Trouble, Rayman 2... Earthworm Jim 3D, and of course Bomberman Hero. So, Bomberman Hero. Let's start with the story. It's your basic save the princess plot. Nothing super different, just something to get the gameplay rolling.
That's right there, sweet tits!
One thing that I realized after coming back to this years later is that there's a surprising amount of cutscenes in this game. They didn't have to be here, but they took the time to animate them, and I got a lot of respect for that. These standard levels, where you have to either just make it to the exit or collect a certain amount of key pieces or whatever, are quite a bit of fun actually, and I'm glad they make up a majority of the game. You can turn the camera a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, and a little bit down, but you don't get to see a whole lot, and it'll immediately reset itself once you start moving again. It's kind of like the camera in Sonic Adventure 2, where you can rotate it, but it'll immediately snap back behind you once you start moving. The depth is a bit off too, and I found myself missing a lot of jumps because of it. Or maybe my depth perception just sucks. The level themes are varied, and they're pretty consistently interesting throughout. Some levels have more than one exit as well, which can open levels you wouldn't have access to if you took the first exit you saw. I like this idea. It encourages replaying the levels, even if all you're probably going to end up doing is just making a beeline for that other exit. One thing I really forgot about after all these years is how slippery the controls can be. I sometimes found myself slipping off the sides of platforms quite often. And the act of throwing bombs in this game can be a bit awkward because there's this arc to them, and depending on your position, they can go clear over the enemy you're trying to hit. In each level, you'll find bomb icons that can increase the number of bombs you can throw at a time, and flame icons which increases the size of the bomb's explosions, but only the size of the explosion, not the damage output. Which ties back to the enemies. Some can be dispatched with only one bomb, but others can take 2 or more bombs. And because they have invincibility frames, you'll oftentimes be sitting there waiting for them to run out before you can throw another bomb at them. and that can kill the pace of the game if you're going for the high score. Oh, what's that? The game has a scoring system? Why, yes, it does. Every time you collect items like jewels that are tallied for some reason, and take out enemies, you gain points. At the end of every level, you are ranked on how many points you get on a scale from 1 to 5, and if you meet or exceed the goal total, you'll hit rank 5. Get rank 5 in every level in the world, and you'll get a gold medal for that world. Get gold medals in all 5 of the game worlds, and you'll unlock the super secret optional 6th world. Yes, I said optional. You don't have to do this to get the game's real ending. Or at least not the one that's relevant to the game's overall plot. Which is good, because getting the high score for every single level can be a real pain. You have to do it all in one life, and if you die before reaching the end, you're sent all the way back to the beginning and your score resets to 0. The levels don't have checkpoints either, and it doesn't help that health isn't restored between levels. This is especially the case for the game's vehicle levels. You have access to the bomber gear, which is comprised of the bomber copter, the bomber jet, bomber marine, and bomber slider. And oh boy, these levels are not good. Save for the 2 levels you get to use the bomber copter. I hate the way the bomber marine controls and how sluggish it is. And the bomber jet, if you're trying to get a good score, is frustrating as there's no way to reverse like you can with the marine. The slider probably has the worst controls out of all of them, and they feel pretty stiff and slippery at the same time. I don't know how to explain that. Just not fun levels to get good scores on at all. Really just not fun to play, period. Special T goes to Freeze Lake. I forgot how bad this level was. It's an absolute nightmare. Yeah, even as a kid, I didn't like these levels. Where the scoring system really takes it in the ass is with the boss fights. In these levels, you start at 99.99, and your score is constantly ticking down, essentially placing you on a time limit. It starts ticking down before you can even move. And you have to finish off the bosses before your score reaches a certain threshold if you want that 5 rank. Some of these can get really stinking close, and that was another factor as to why I just didn't bother with the 5 ranks in every level. This all sounds really rough, and it can be, but the levels themselves are rather short. In fact, if you don't care about the ranking system at all, they can be cleared within like a minute or 2. As you can see, I did make a genuine effort to get all rank 5s at first, but then very quickly gave up on it when I started having such a rough time with it. Again, it's not required unless you really want that 6th world that's kinda disconnected from the main plot anyway. One thing I definitely didn't remember about this game was how god-awful the frame rate can get. And yeah, I know that the Nintendo 64 was a piece of technology that really struggled keeping good frame rates at times, but I was genuinely surprised at how bad this game's frame rate got so frequently. At first I thought my emulator was crapping out, but I did some research and apparently the frame rate was actually a big problem back then. And that's crazy because there's usually not a whole lot on screen at once, but it'll still dip down to what had to have been below 10 frames per second. Also, my emulator crashed frequently during my recording sessions, but that's an unrelated issue, as I remember the real physical game never doing that. Luckily for me, though, the game auto-saves after each level. I don't remember a lot of Nintendo 64 games with autosave. Even the big ones like Mario, Banjo, Rayman 2, you had to prompt the game to save. Not this one, though, and it was actually pretty nice. Very forward-thinking. Well, I've spent the last few minutes just berating the game and listing all of its major flaws, but there is one huge positive about this game that's stuck with me since the first time I played it as a kid. And, of course, I'm talking about the soundtrack. I mean, what can I say about it that hasn't already been said at this point? Japanese composer Jun Chikuma deserves some kind of award for the beat-heavy techno soundtrack she made for this. It is arguably the best thing to come out of this game. But even so, after everything I've said, I still think the game is fun to play if you're not going for all 5 ranks. It really all just comes down to that, and me thinking the Bomber Gear levels outright suck. And the game in general just feeling like it's aged. Then also the performance issues that were pretty common for N64 games. But yeah, you can find loose copies of it on eBay for pretty cheap nowadays, so if you still have a functioning N64, I'd say it's worth checking out if you're nostalgic for games for that era. You could do better, but you could also do a lot worse.